everybody. My name is Dr. Digby James Wren. I am broadcasting to you from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And this morning I'd like to introduce you to part 2 of the Multipolar Peace Now initiative. That's a collective of top geopolitical commentators and experts on YouTube and other social media platforms across the world. So let's get right to it.
It's a show about the present state of the world and hopefully a show that will help us all and our viewers and people around the world think about what the future state of the world could possibly look like. I realized that last time we did the show, I didn't even introduce myself, and that's probably a little bit remiss of me. I think everyone else is far more important than me, but for the sake of completeness, my name is Warwick Powell. I'm an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology. I'm a senior fellow at Taihe Institute, and I've got the pleasure tonight of being your host and sitting back and listening to the ideas and the analysis and the thinking of everyone else who's on the panel today. So we've got, again, in no particular order, Pascal Lottaz, who operates the Neutrality Studies channel, which is going great guns on YouTube. In fact, I don't know how Pascal does it in between everything else he does. And Pascal is actually the technical host of our panel today as well. So thanks again, Pascal, for the work that you do. We have Digby Wren. Digby is a senior advisor to the Cambodian government and is a significant international relations scholar and an educator working out of the Royal Academy in Phnom Penh. We have joining us for the first time an old friend of Multipolarity, Hussein Askari from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. Welcome, Hussein. It's great to see you. And
thank you very much.
In your brains.
Very happy to be with this great group.
Fantastic. We've got David Wallalu, who is well known across the independent media landscape as one of the most active and prominent educators and content creators, who joins us from Dallas, Texas. S.L. Kanthan, who comes to us from Bangalore in India and brings a very unique and an important perspective when we're talking about the unfolding world of multipolarity. Welcome again, SL. SL is the host of Geopolitics Decoded, I think, if I've got that right. If I haven't, forgive me. But no doubt Pascal will have everybody's details in the description below. Ina Tangan is a global commentator on global affairs and is based in Beijing these days, but takes a broad sweep in terms of keeping a close eye on what's happening around the world, particularly in terms of how it affects peace and development. I'm really happy to finally be able to meet face to face with Kathleen, who's in London. Kathleen's an author and a former central banker. I don't know if that is a tick or a cross, but I guess that depends on your perspective and your particular moment in life. But the book that Kathleen's
the author of, long time ago.
But
I was certainly to London in 1990.
Well, it certainly brings a depth of experience and knowledge.
I'm better known as a plumber of capital markets infrastructure. I was a co-inventor of something called tri-party repo, which is now 18 trillion a day in interbank secured credit. So
was that a good idea?
It was, absolutely. Globalization of the economy wouldn't have been possible without it. So it was absolutely a good idea. And I got U.S. treasuries into Luxembourg, into the stream depository. Both of those things, globalized credit, globalized banking, globalized markets. And, as long as we don't screw it up, it's a good system.
Correct. And out of all of that experience is a book that is called Multi-Currency Mercantilism, which is available from all good bookstores, and
available on Amazon.
Available on Amazon and other good bookstores. John Pang, a scholar and a former government advisor from Malaysia, working in China at the moment, but crosses backwards and forwards to build bridges within Southeast Asia. And we have, last but not least, Anna Malandogui. And forgive me if my pronunciation is at a very, very low level, but I will promise to work hard to improve that as time goes by. Anna is a renowned researcher and scholar on Southeast Asian matters, and particularly in relation to developments impacting the Philippines and also the relationships between Philippines and China. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. Where we're at is at the end of a week where NATO has held its 75th anniversary summit in New York. And from my perspective, it was quite a macabre, somber affair, particularly in terms of the decor and the fit out and the color schemes and the shading. But, you know, other than those aesthetic elements, it certainly has made some very bold statements about its own views of itself, its purpose in the world, and how it sees the world unfolding and what it needs to do. And perhaps we can kick off today's panel with a little bit of an overview as to what has come out of this NATO summit. And I might pass it to Pascal to do that, because Pascal's actually done a video yesterday around these themes. So perhaps, Pascal, you can just bring us all up to speed with what's happened out of NATO.
Thank you very much, Warwick, again for convening the panel. So the NATO summit just closed, and the most important thing actually was published the day before the closing meeting, which is the outcome document, the communique, or this time they actually call it a declaration. I don't know whether there's a difference in that, but it's structured like all the other outcome documents, like last year from Vilnius. It starts with the heads of states of the 32 member countries. I mean, this year is the first time that they have 32, because now Sweden has also joined. And the document obviously is not something that was negotiated at the event, but that was done previously. And I suppose that you just had to make sure that all the 32 actually signed off on it. I don't know how you did that. That's a real question, because right before this event, we had Viktor Orban, who's, of course, the head of state of Hungary, who traveled to Moscow and Beijing, and now just yesterday or like 12 hours ago met with Mr. Trump. And obviously, he's not on board with the general NATO message, but the general NATO message is we stand united, nobody can divide us. The Russia is is the biggest threat to European security, and is the only one to blame. It actually says that again in the document for the war in Ukraine. And most importantly, the document for the first time mentions that China has responsibility as well for the war. I mean, if it wasn't for China, then Russia could never sustain its warfare. It's an utterly ridiculous narrative, but that's what's in there. And Jens Stoltenberg actually in his message also said several times that China is to blame for a lot of the things that Russia are able to do. They are blaming dual-use goods for enabling Russia to still do war on Ukraine. And dual-use goods is just a very old idea, actually, of expanding the definition of contraband of war. So on the one hand, NATO actually acknowledges that China doesn't send weapons directly to Russia, but it accuses China of sending dual-use goods. So this is another way of putting pressure. NATO puts pressure on China to stop trading with Russia. That's the main baseline saying. And it also says, like, if you don't stop this, then we will expand sanctions, and there will be more sanctions. And you, China, have to expect sanctions from the European Union, which is like an indirect command to the Europeans to now take over a lot of US sanctions on China. and just, you know, expand this economic warfare on China as well. And it seems that we are moving in that direction. One more significant thing is that NATO decided to give $40 billion next year to Ukraine, which is what they estimate what is needed in order to maintain the current level of carnage. In order to keep on fighting until the last Ukrainian, $40 billion distributed according to proportionally according to GDP. This, what we know from the media, is meant to Trump-proof Ukraine aid by basically outsourcing it to NATO. But this is, of course, a dumb narrative, because if everybody from NATO has to put up money proportionally, then 55% of those 40 billion should come from the United States next year. And the outcome document is also quite vague in the sense that it says, you know, anything counts towards these 40 billions, direct payments, humanitarian aid, military aid, in-kind aid. So you can already see how the outcome document tries to keep the definition of aid as vague as possible. So I think that's where we are. The main issue today being that NATO seems to want to shift blame to China. Interestingly, though, although they had 4 basically Pacific nations joining, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, they didn't invent anything new. At least I haven't seen any new way of docking in these 4 Pacific Island nations. I mean, they're observing what's happening, but I haven't heard any announcement of NATO operationally doing something new toward Asia Pacific that we haven't known already.
Thanks, Pascal. Kathleen, you're in London, and we've got a new government in London that made great haste to get itself on the phone to Washington and to demonstrate its, I guess its loyalties to the Washington and NATO arrangements. We also know that NATO has, over the course of the last month or 2 at the very least, been talking up this China threat and China responsibility issue as a rationale to justify its move into Asia. But it doesn't just want to move into Asia, it wants to become a global organization, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Two outcomes that were omitted from Pascal's summary: our new NATO office to be established in Jordan in the Middle East, and the NATO declaration, that sounds ominous, also includes targeting Africa, expansion of NATO cooperation into Africa. So they really used this 75th anniversary to make it official that they are no longer North Atlantic. They are now Pacific, Middle East, Africa, a global force for war.
Well, the A perhaps now stands for Africa, Asia, and America as well, doesn't it?
Asia.
Yeah. And in terms of Keir Starmer, I think what's happened is they wanted the prime minister for World War III. And Keir Starmer has a long track record of cooperating with Washington. He was selected as our next prime minister by Mike Pompeo, very likely. So that'll provide continuity into Trump. Yeah, he's never disobeyed a direct order from Washington. So he'll continue that in his premiership, unfortunately. The announcements that he made as prime minister, basically within the first day, were more money to Ukraine, 87 billion in UK military expenditure, and seeking hypersonic missiles. So, you know, he's definitely the wartime prime minister. We just don't have the World War III quite yet.
Looks like that they're working at it, though. Look, Anna, in terms of the perspectives from Asia, what's your sense in terms of the reactions to this globalization move by NATO and its very clear statement of intent, I think, that it seeks to intensify its activities and focus within the Asian arena.
I think from what I can see from the Asian context, especially in Southeast Asia, of course, a lot of people, I mean, are very much worried that NATO will have presence in the Asia Pacific region, and it will open an office, or I think it's already, I'm not really sure, but an office in Japan, and I think the Philippines also is in the middle of all of these things, given that there's a big and a strong influence coming with the current administration of Marcos Jr. I mean, as you can see, the presence of American forces. Now we have an RAA, which actually already signed between the two governments, Japan and the Philippines. It would mean also that Japanese troops and Japanese military assets could be transferred in the Philippines, and you have already a missile launcher in the north of the Philippines. So all of these things are quite very critical, and it seems that the way we see it, people who are against these things and peacemakers in Southeast Asia and even in the Philippines are very much worried that all of these things that's going in the country, in the Philippines right now, the militarization of the Philippines, the very active presence of American forces, military assets, Japan is coming in, you have Australia also in my country. I think it's all connected to the plan that NATO in any ways is really trying to have a presence in Asia Pacific, and you have this kind of trilateral pact, and also with Japan, United States, and the Philippines in a way, militarily speaking. So all of this, in a matter of time, we personally and other people with the same kind of advocacy, we see it as a preparation for any kind of, hopefully not, but war in the horizon. I think that's how we feel. But of course, as much as possible, we want to prevent this. And also we have our own challenges in our own country, given that the current administration of the Philippines and Marcos Jr., as you can see, is really heavily influenced by the United States. And he's like a puppet, like, Zelensky in that sense. So with regard to NATO, we know that it wants to extend itself in Asia Pacific, and you can see already some presence of their forces, because the American forces is very strong in my country at the moment. So yeah, it's a bit alarming, and of course it's not good, but the situation is a little bit more critical, I think, as far as the Philippines is concerned, because the Philippines is really, among Southeast Asian countries, is the one that has a military pact and treaty with the United States. And now it has a military defense pact with Japan. So, yeah.
Yeah, it certainly puts the Philippines very much in the, well, I was going to say in the firing line, though that's probably not a particularly good turn of phrase. Digby, what are you hearing on the ground from Phnom Penh?
Well, they're clearly not happy. They don't want to see any destabilization of the region. They don't want any interference, and they see this as causing complications. I mean, I think that the term they used exactly was, this is just further complications of an already difficult situation. The first thing to say is that there is no conflict in the Pacific. So point of NATO coming here to sort of help peace and stabilization is kind of a contradiction already, because as everybody's said, it's just a further complication, and it does destabilize more. And so it's doing the exact opposite of what it's going to claim to do. I think the other thing that came about from that conversation was that Japan's role is greater than most people think. They're actively doing this. Japan has been the power behind the Quad arrangement in real terms. The Japanese feel that they need to. They're the most fearful of all in terms of losing any kind of control over the Pacific. and they see that slipping away, in fact, and that's mostly due to their own insecurities, but also because of their economy. I mean, their economy has been stagnant for 30 years and it's not getting any better, and their exports are dropping at the same time that their currency is dropping. So there's an enormous amount of insecurity in Japan. And so they're pushing for this as hard as they can. And the Americans, of course, are very happy to push them along, help them try and do that. And then the other thing that came out of this was something related to AUKUS, and that is, for example, that although the Australians are probably never going to get those submarines, it's highly unlikely, but what they did get and what they have been getting is capacity upgrading. And I think that there's a kernel of truth in this, that this expansion of NATO into the Pacific is going to cover capacity upgrading, so interoperability of weapon systems, all sorts of new capabilities with cyber, with satellite, with all that sort of thing. And the Americans, of course, are very keen to do this because it'll tie all of these, the IP4, for example, tie them into very long-term military contracts, which will ensure that the Americans have some input for their industrial base and for the services that are required after you've supplied weapons. And so that's very much a sort of an economic as well as a military thing. And then just so I don't speak too long about this, the other thing that came out of that conversation was the idea that, in fact, it really displays that all these economies, so the American economy, the Japanese economy, the German economy, the European economy, all in recession, or functionally or technically in recession. And here they are trying to expand their military coverage of the globe, which costs enormous amounts of money. And so how are they going to pay for all of this? And so the obvious answer is that it's basically a QE4. They're actually going to print money and pump it into their economies for their industrial bases, while their economies are in recession. So it's a kind of a tool to revitalize their economies. So it casts some doubt into the long-term, not the short-term, but definitely the medium to long-term viability of this project. And at this point in time, I think it really is only a project, and it's making it's a big splash for 75 years, but I don't think it's going to have any legs, really.
I will want to come back to really these questions of viability, both in an economic sense as well as some of the other challenges that I think the Grand Plan, the 75th anniversary Grand Plan, might confront. But perhaps before we do that, I just want to get some perspectives also from John, again, from Southeast Asia, a region that actually, as Digby said, does not have any conflict. Being now targeted by an organisation to supposedly
we'll create some.
We'll create some conflict to bring peace. Feedback, John, from the folk that you're talking to.
Sorry to interrupt you, Warwick. The phrase was the United States is both the core, is the cause of the destabilization, and it's offering the cure.
Yeah.
So it's cause and cure.
This is a very, very familiar model. This is the self-licking ice cream cone, right, of U.S. policy. There is, I mean, it's quite interesting to be in this forum, which is, we have a global circle of friends, and Southeast Asia is usually actually not represented, and here we're almost overrepresented. But I think this issue of NATO globalizing itself has been a useful one for us to focus on over the course of this week, right? As I said, kind of a NATO week. And there is actually, but this doesn't sort of take away from the sense that there is something both worrying and troubling, but at the same time farcical about global NATO. You just can't get away from it. As Digby was saying just now, we have all these countries in domestic internal crisis, both economic and actually political. They've just started the greatest land war in Europe since the Second World War. And then in the middle of it, it's escalating. And there's serious concern that this is going to go out of control and escalate into a third world war, which will involve the rest of us in it again. Remember that from the perspective of Asia, from the perspective of the rest of the world, it's Europe that is the progenitor of world war. As I learned from Pascal, this is going to be about the fifth European world war. These generalized conflicts of all against all. This is not something you find in, a lot in Asian history. So there's something about this, and they're dragging us into this, forces us to look at this in a broader perspective. Last time we met, we spoke about the 5 principles of coexistence. We had time to talk about that. I always look at things from an ASEAN perspective. Next year, we celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Bandung conference, at which these 5 principles, these principles of coexistence, of neutrality, and so forth, were adopted on very, very widely across most of the world, actually. So you have one principle of world ordering, and you have NATO very neatly and with self-declaration, and that's the declaration is the exact word, pushing another way of organizing the world, which is completely abhorrent, actually, to the way things are done in Southeast Asia. I just want to say this. This is really not the way we do things. It's abhorrent. It is everything that you want to avoid. But think of it from the Southeast Asian perspective. Over the last 18 months, or even 12 months, think of the number of these minilateral or these alliance structures laid on top of a structure that we already had for East Asian regional coordination, security coordination, and so on. It's not as if there weren't already these structures, which we like to say are centered on ASEAN. So not just on the diplomatic level, but for defense establishments of all the countries in East Asia, for the United States as well, to be involved and to have their say. But then you have AUKUS, you have the Quad, you have the trilateral, as Anna was saying, right, between Japan, Korea, South Korea, and the US. And now you want NATO in here. I'm not sure how this is all going to fit together. The big picture is, it seems as if, the farcical and the ludicrous in this is, what the hell is the German Navy going to be doing out here? Or the Dutch Navy? This is a maritime region, okay? So what, you want the Dutch and the Spanish back here? What are they going to contribute? A lot of this is going to be about upping the contribution. Actually, it's about increasing the burden sharing from the US perspective. I hear a lot of voices now, okay, from the US about NATO members taking more of their own share. A lot of it's going to be that. You guys are going to have to stump up. There's, of course, going to be more sort of interoperability and so on and so forth. But there is truly a ludicrous aspect to this. I'm not sure they add anything to the danger that there already is. It just makes it more incoherent and just flat out crazy,
I'll say
yeah,
that.
I think.
And I'll just observe that the French and the Dutch navies didn't last very long in the Red Sea against the Houthis.
Yeah, it was just the Houthis, right?
So. Well, and that point, Kathleen, I think is going to, in a sense, continue to bug this NATO plan, because a plan is one thing and stated ambitions is one thing, but I think we're starting to see that there's more to a plan than just being able to have a declaration, I guess. And there are significant issues in reality, both in a physical sense, but also the reality of financing and resourcing these ambitions that may end up causing other problems. Speaking of burden sharing, Hussein, Sweden's just come in. You're in Sweden these days. What's the sort of state of play in terms of the expectations and the attitudes? I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the political elite within the Swedish establishment are, of course, looking forward to being members of NATO, but there may be nonetheless residual concerns within the sort of broader society about what this actually entails for the country that has been in effect neutral for a long time.
Yeah, well, I think both watching the NATO summit, but also Sweden being there is quite tragic. Actually shows what an existential crisis we are living in here. I don't happen to be in Sweden. I'm a Swedish citizen. I have lived here for more than 30 years. I have children and grandchildren born and raised here in Sweden. And I'm worried about their future because with the militarization of our society, by the way, usually in Sweden, as you said, we are a neutral country for more than 200 years. And for such important things, strategic things, like joining NATO, you usually have a referendum. This time it was not allowed to have a referendum because they suspected that the people would vote no. And therefore, there would be no referendum. We are in a war situation. We are in a war economy. We are in a war mobilization. We are under threat. We have security issues. No more discussions. So everybody from left to right have to follow a uniform policy. And any discussion to the contrary will be considered as aiding the Russian war effort. So people here are terrified to speak, about the rationality of continuing the support for Ukraine. Now, we have had deep financial, economic, social problems in Sweden, not now, not the last 10 years, not since the Ukraine war, but since the 1990s, because we have had a deindustrialization policy, at least since the late 80s. People think that deindustrialization in Germany started with the Ukraine war. No, it started in the 1990s. I witnessed that myself. I was working in the Schiller Institute in Germany, and I saw how the green ideology was devouring the German society in the name of protecting the environment. So deindustrialization was a fact a long time ago and was replaced by this consumer society, financialization of society, which we are a huge financial bubble. It's ready to burst anyway. And this is the underlying reality, actually, of the elites in Europe and the United States, hoping to have another splendid war, as Winston Churchill said, to solve their problems. Now, we have to divert now 2% of our GDP to the war mobilization, throwing money into Ukraine, into what Pascal said, it's like a carnage where young Ukrainian and now even older Ukrainian men and some women are being sacrificed for a useless war effort. This whole thing is like we have to cut more in our healthcare, education, infrastructure, more than what we have had. We already in trouble, but we will have even more trouble. And this is making people frustrated all over Europe. That's why you see in the elections, all people, instead of speaking out, they vote. And then you have a chaotic situation where nobody can really form a government, but it's more and more people are expressing their frustration by voting to right-wing extreme parties who seem to be against the mainstream. So the thing is, all this talk about global NATO has been globalized for a long time. My native country, Iraq, was a victim of that system, although it was not in the name of NATO. Iraq, where I was born, it was destroyed by the rules-based order for the right to protect and all this nonsense. But this all American military forces, all American military bases, all NATO bases around the world, all their conventional weapons are obsolete. They cannot even defeat the Houthis, a bunch of people in the mountains. That's where, it's ridiculous. As John said, this is a farcical situation. That the reality is that the economic reality of the West has been deteriorating and is unable to wage anything meaningful. Now, if people forget actually that in August 2021, people woke up to find out that the emperor had no clothes when NATO had hurry up and leave Kabul and Afghanistan. That was the end of the global NATO. The utter failure, 20 years in Afghanistan, and everything was back to box one. They didn't build one road in Afghanistan. They didn't build any hospital in Afghanistan. So the only danger is from the insanity of the elites in Europe and the United States, where they say we have to defeat a nuclear power. You cannot defeat a nuclear power with conventional warfare. You can only defeat a nuclear power using nuclear weapons. And this is what is scary. Everything else which is being talked about, moving global, going to the South Pacific, all this is nonsense. These rusty ships the British and the Australians have, and including the United States. I mean, American military experts say even the American aircraft carriers, they will be sunk in 5 minutes in a war with China. So just forget about this. The problem is that we are losing time and energy instead of building bridges and building the world economy, ridding the world of poverty and prospering together. And this, what is the tragic? This 1 week before the NATO summit, I was in Beijing attending the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. I actually was there listening to President Xi. I was at the luncheon with Minister Wang Yi. I met him and gave him my book as a gift. And then I followed the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the language and the sentiments you feel there about harmony, cooperation, prosperity, optimism, is such a contrast to coming back here to Sweden and watching the EU summit, the NATO summit, and the language there being used like confrontation. We are the best. We should, defeat the others. The others are bad. We have to save ourselves. It's like complete contrast, 2 different philosophies clashing in the world now. And that's where I see the danger is. I don't see there's a danger of the NATO being able to win any conventional warfare. What they will do is they will create trouble and they will delay economic development among nations and exchange, cultural, civilizational cooperation. And this is what is really sad.
Look, this is actually the perfect segue really into what, in a sense, in my mind, was part 2, which is bringing it back to the contrast between NATO and its sort of modus operandi and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization by way of contrast. And you touched on that. And we'll come back to a bit more of that, I hope, shortly. But I really wanted to pick S.L. Kanthan's brain and then David's brains on 2 other events that have happened against the backdrop of this NATO week, and that is firstly the visit to Russia by the Indian Prime Minister Modi as the first place that he visited after the election, which I think is quite unusual going to Russia for this. And then after getting some insights from USL, I'd like to get David's insights. David's pretty close to Florida where he is, and that was the last stop for Viktor Orban on his 5-city peace tour. And then I'm going to throw back to you, Aina, to, in a sense, maybe pull some of these threads together before we get back into, I guess, thinking more constructively about what an alternative might begin to look like. So, SL, what are your thoughts against this backdrop and with Prime Minister Modi heading off to Moscow?
Sure. So I think it was really a watershed moment in India's foreign policy. Because if you look at the timing, the words, and the actions, it was very shocking for the West. And you can see the pain and the agony that everybody in the US is feeling. And the Modi government, they did all of that very specifically and purposefully. So there was no need for him to go to Russia now as the first nation after his 3rd election. He could have just waited for the BRICS summit later this year, and he could have just met with Putin. But he really wanted to send a message saying, hey guys, we are going to have a strategic autonomy, and we have realized that it's a multipolar world, and we're not going to be a vassal of the US. The world is changing, and here is the message. So the timing, that's number one. And then the words, well, if there is one phrase the US really, really hates, and that's multipolar world. Okay, because the phrase multipolar world means the end of the unipolar world. means the end of the American century, the end of Pax Americana. It's just very gloom and doom, the phrase multipolar world. And the Indian establishment has been like saying it nonstop over the last couple of months. Jaishankar, he said, the multipolar world is totally unstoppable. You know, so he basically sent a message to the US. Listen, this is the future. And then he went on to say that if there is one constant in global geopolitics, that's the India-Russia relationship. Wow. You know, that must have really, really hurt the Washington, D.C.'s hearts and the internal organs, you know, because he basically said, listen.
Can I jump in quickly, SL here, jump in quickly because the American ambassador to India made some remarks about India's standing and basically said, you can't be neutral. It's not possible. It's not going to accept that. But of course, that's exactly what India is doing.
Yeah. So that comes afterwards, right? So, I mean, Jaishankar's words were before Modi's trip. So he said there's only one constant in the geopolitics of the world, and that's India-Russia relationship. So he basically said, listen, the US-India relationship, sometimes it comes, sometimes it goes. It's not dependable. So that must have really hurt Americans. So that's why, you know, you can see the pain on the social media, the New York Times, Washington Post, they're all crying. And then the US ambassador to India, he gave a speech yesterday, and he kind of reframed George Bush's famous warning, you know, like if you are not with us, then you are against us. So he said, listen, there is no such thing as strategic autonomy. Because if there is a conflict, then you cannot have a strategic autonomy. You have to choose a side. So first of all, that's a wrong logic. You know, people have stayed neutral all the time throughout the history of World War II, you know, Switzerland, right in the middle of Europe. He said, hey, guys, I'm sorry. I'm not going with anyone, right? So that's a ridiculous argument or logic. I mean, and number two, you know, the US is at war all the time. Then that means India has but no strategic autonomy because it has to take side with the warmonger all the time. You know, so, but this is like a lady having a boyfriend who gets into bar fights every weekend, you know, and then he always blames others. So, those are the timing and the words, and then the actions. You know, there was no need for so much love shown in the photo ops between Modi and Putin, you know. They gave each other big hug. They called each other my friend. They went on the golf court and dinner, tea. It was just a total, I mean, love fest, which must have been so horrible for the Americans to watch. And then they also signed a lot of deals. And India, Russia are working on so many long-term deals, you know, whether it's the joint production of various military weapons from rifles to BrahMos missiles to the Su-30 fighter jets. There's a lot of technology transfer that Russia is really willing to do. That's number one. And then the trade, the north-south, the transport corridor through Central Asia and Iran, that must really tick off the US because India is bonding with two of America's rivals, Russia and Iran. So that's really terrible. And then India is trying to do, so Putin is trying to strike a deal, which would be totally unprecedented for India. And that's for joint operations of the military. So the Russian troops and the Indian troops would fight together. The Russian fighter jets and the Indian fighter jets would fight together. Same with the warships. And if Putin can do that, wow, that's going to blow the minds away in Washington, D.C. So the background for all of this and the reason for all of this is that the Indian elites have finally understood the rise of the multipolar world, and that the U.S. empire is not going to last that long. Because if you read the articles in India over the last, since the COVID days, there was this fantasy, they thought that all the manufacturing from China was going to come to India. Wow, we're going to be like the next China. We're going to be the manufacturing superpower. That didn't happen. And then when the Ukraine war started, a lot of the think tanks in India said, oh my God, Russia is going to be isolated. Putin is not going to last too long. Russia has nothing to offer, and so on. The typical American talking points. But the last 2 years have been a wake-up call. So Russia is strong, China is strong. The world hasn't changed as the US predicted. So basically, India is going back to her, the real love, Russia, the steady lover for the last 75, 80 years. So that's the story.
Yeah, that's remarkable. And at the same time, we had Viktor Orban basically make an unprecedented trip, which no doubt took quite a bit of courage, given the reaction that we've seen from his European partners in particular, as well as partners in, well, partners is a loose word, but the partners in Washington. David, as I said, you're actually a stone's throw away from where Orban ended up meeting with Trump. But from your perspective, could you just fill in the picture, I guess, in terms of what Orban's been doing and why that matters in this week of really, in many ways, it's a transformative week.
Well, basically, for the Prime Minister Viktor Orban's trip to Moscow and to Beijing, it says a lot about his concerns about what lies ahead for Europe, because NATO is going to be pushing one way or another. As a matter of fact, there is now a conversation. I had a chance to talk to some of my contacts in Europe, that there's a conversation right now in Brussels within the EU Council as to sort of removing the presidency of Hungary, because Hungary is taking the presidency for the next 6 months of the European Union, which will be a violation of the law, basically, and the so-called the democratic norm. How can you remove someone because he or she is doing the right thing? And what Orban sort of embarked on was courageous, taking a stand and preventing Europe from another disaster war. This is exactly why the European Union didn't like it. And it's not about the European Union, it's what Washington dictates to Europe, because we here in the United States, our foreign policy has always been heavy on a rhetoric, but is empty on substance. I mean, we didn't have a foreign policy strategy for the last 30 or 40 years. And now things coming to the open, if I may use the term here, especially with NATO declaration during their final communique, as far as, for example, I'll give you just a quick example here. And I know some of my panelists here mentioned this earlier, the opening of the office in Amman, in Jordan. So why the heck is NATO going to open an office in Amman? Because the concern now that Middle Eastern countries, the like of Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, have pivoted east. And they pivoted east because of economic incentives, economic prosperity. That is the reason why NATO wanted to sink its claws inside Jordan to protect, of course, the monarchy from falling, because Jordanians are finding it very, very concerning that there are American troops on their soil without their knowledge, as it was in the Tanaf base, which is on the border between Jordan and Syria. That's what it was. Now, the idea of why there is this pushback against Mr. Orban initiative, it's because the West, collective West, does not want a peace. They want to maintain, especially NATO wants to maintain the narrative that there's always an enemy by personifying now North Koreans and the Chinese as the main enemy in Asia. Why? Because they wanted to take, and this is nothing new now. I was aware of the conversation even back in my days in Washington, D.C. The whole conversation about pivoting towards China started in 2004. And we were like, okay, why? Why do we need to pivot over to Asia for? Why are you targeting China? Why is this? Why is that? The whole objective of it was at that time still, and it will be, to prevent any economic progression for the whole Asia. That is what's at the heart of it. Mr. Orban's initiative is not sort of, it's reflecting very good on his part, but it is not boding well for the European and the American sort of political elites.
Yeah, a lot of things going on. I know you're in Beijing. Well, I'm guessing you're in Beijing. You could be anywhere, actually. But I guess I really just wanted to round out the picture before diving a little bit more into thinking about the future. Beijing was singled out in the NATO declaration as being a decisive enabler, I think was the words, of Russia. Beijing's obviously reacted to that, but I'm interested in not only your take on Beijing's reaction to that very specific allegation, but also how you're sensing the sort of overarching big picture looks like from that part of the world as far as these transformations are taking place.
Well, I mean, there's always plenty of divisions within the Chinese government in terms of what the direction. There's always the side that says we need to do tit for tat. We need to show them we're serious. Then you have others who say, well, you know, when you see a man running towards a cliff, you don't have to push him over. Right now, the U.S. has tactics. They have strategies. At most, it takes you out 2 years, but there's no end game. That has been very apparent. I wish people understood, and I think some of you do who've been in Washington, how little regard Americans have for Europe and the rest of the world. Part of it's racial. With Europe, it goes back to World War II and World War I. You know, these people are unreliable. We have to take them in hand, blah, blah, blah. Right now, we simply are trying to shift the cost of policing the world without giving up the baton. And that's basically all of this stuff with NATO is about. What's interesting is, as the panel pointed out, you have groups that are acquiescing, in terms of the Philippines, Marcos, and then you have others who are not. Obviously, India is playing game. Coincidentally, I mean, I would just want to add my take on the Indian situation. Modi blames the U.S. For interfering in the election. He believes they played a part in his, ignominious win. He wanted to win big, and he didn't get it. So there is some concern on his part that the U.S. thinks that they own him, and he wants to show that he's his own man. He's also looking for some sort of political win. It's no secret that he would like to have India on the Security Council. That would take the cooperation of China, obviously. Russia probably could go along with it. The U.S. Have said that they would. That leaves Britain and the rest. And there's some sense that the reason that Jay Shankar has now mentioned 3 times that he wants to deal with the border dispute is that perhaps that would be the quid pro quo for allowing India on the Security Council. I just don't think it will work. On the other hand, you also have Russia. In America, we're the victim of our own predictions. We said Russia, as pointed out by the panelists, would fail, they'd lose the war, and their economy would go on, and Putin would be on the street, or if not hanging from a lamppost. That didn't happen, and that's obviously emboldened the world. Right now, I'm very much in the camp that says if you see somebody running towards a cliff who's not your friend, you don't need to stop them, and you certainly don't need to try to help them over. The U.S. has no end game. Getting these countries that are in dire economic stress to put 2% of their budgets into the military is not going to work out with the voters long term. They're concerned about domestic issues. You've seen this through countless surveys. This is what they want, and they're not getting it from their elites. And so at some point, the runway ends, and there's no liftoff, and they will be ignominiously shuffled off, and somebody else. I'm not saying they'll be better. I'm just saying that some populists, as you have with the right, will come in and say that we can help you just get rid of the foreigners and things. So it's not a good projection into the future, but you certainly can see all these different currents playing out.
Look, the alternative landscape, I guess, started to take a bit of shape, didn't it, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which talked a lot about security, but very much from an internally oriented perspective, but hammered out some pretty significant economic-related deals concerning energy security and trade, as well as the ongoing progression, both at an SCO level and also at BRICS, on this issue of an alternative payment system.
So that's the end of part 2, and now we're going to head into part 3. Now I just cut this because it's so long, so it was 2 hours, so I've cut it into 2 one-hour parts. Enjoy, and hope this will give you food for thought about multipolarity and the transition to the multipolar world, and why peace initiatives are so important at this time.